In order to reason about the prisoner's dilemma, it is useful to introduce the concept of dominating strategies. Let S and T be two strategies of some player I. Then we say that S dominates strategy T if for any fixed actions of all the other players in the game, the payoff that player I receives when using strategy S is always strictly higher than when player I is using strategy T. We also say that strategy T is dominated by strategy S. The idea behind this is that if strategy S dominates strategy T, then the player should never play strategy T. Whatever the situation is, whatever the other players are doing, the payoff that the player receives would always be larger if the player picks strategy S instead of T. So strategy T is sort of useless for the player. Now, with this idea, let's write down the prisoner's dilemma game again. We have two players, the conductor and Tchaikovsky, and each of them can either confess or stay silent. Depending on what both players do, each of them will serve a certain amount of time in prison, and we wrote this down in this table like this. We can see that for both players, the strategy to confess dominates the strategy to stay silent. For example, consider the conductor. If Tchaikovsky confesses, staying silent would mean spending 25 years in prison for the conductor, whereas confessing would mean only spending 10 years in prison. So confessing is clearly better. If Tchaikovsky does not confess, on the other hand, staying silent would mean 2 years in prison for the conductor, whereas confessing would mean only 1 year in prison. So in this case, confessing is better as well. Either way, the conductor has an incentive to confess. Through this reasoning, we can see that we should expect both players to confess, because it turns out that each player can determine their best action without having to reason about the other player's action. We don't need to know what the other player is doing. We know what we should be doing. This game is another example of something tragic in the sense that we predict that both players confess and therefore spend 10 years in prison each, when there was a much better outcome available to both players. If both players stayed silent, both of them would only spend 2 years in prison. The problem for the prisoners is that this outcome is not stable, because both players would see that they can improve their own situation by confessing. I told you we would encounter more examples of tragic outcomes in these videos.